In this video, I'm going to share 5 tips for creating better environmental portraits. Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Andre Brown and welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to be talking about environmental portraits. Now, environmental portraits are a huge part of my business. As a wedding and portrait photographer, I do a ton of wall art sales, and it's typically from environmental portraits. And since I've been so intentional about capturing these portraits, I do find that a lot of clients hire me because they see the work and they want something similar. So to kick it off, the very first thing that I generally start with is lens selection. Now, my lens selection is really contingent on the environment that I'm trying to capture. If it's something architectural, then I'm typically somewhere with the 16 to 35 or 14 to 35. Whereas if I'm doing something that's just merely environmental, maybe outside in nature, inside of a building, then I'll likely be somewhere in that 24 to 70, or in my case, the 28 to 70. I don't really have a suggestion for one lens over the other. I just use the lens that I need to be able to capture the environment that I want to capture. Next, let's talk about settings. So for the most part, I'm shooting these images at f4 or 5.6, which is why I can get away with a 14 to 35 or a 16 to 35 f4. The RF lenses are incredibly sharp, so even at f4, you can see that this lens has so much detail even when you look at the buildings that are far back. And when it comes to ISO and shutter speed, these things can be kind of interchangeable as to where I prioritize them. This is mainly based on the conditions that I'm in or the creative style that I'm trying to accomplish. So in general, my shutter speed is gonna be at sync speed, which is 200 or 250, depending on what camera you're in. And that's because I'm likely taking these portraits using off-camera flash. But depending on the circumstances, that could change if I'm in an environment where I need to do high-speed sync. I may also do something different with the shutter speed, like maybe bring it way down, maybe to a 50th of a second if I'm tossing a veil and I want that soft, creamy look of the veil flowing in the air. The motion blur that you get inside of the veil just adds to the overall creative effect of the image. As for ISO, again, it's all based on the conditions that I'm in. If I'm outside in bright sunlight, then I'm likely at 100 ISO, or maybe even low, which on Canon is an ISO of 50. But maybe if it's later on in the evening, like getting closer to sunset, then I might have to raise that ISO up to as much as 800 or maybe even 1250 to be able to capture the detail in whatever structure that I'm photographing. Again, none of these are right or wrong. It's all just contingent on the conditions that you're in at the time to be able to capture the image that you want to be able to create. Next, we have our lighting. Now, for me, that could be any number of tools. I do environmental portraits using just natural light, so using the sun as my key light source. But most of the time, you'll find that I'm doing these portraits with off-camera flash, which is my Westcott FJ200s, and maybe sometimes the 400, depending on the circumstances. If you've seen any of my lighting videos, then you know that I also carry the Stella Pro CLX10 and the Reflex S. Now, both of these come in handy too, again, depending on the conditions. If I'm shooting indoors and I want to be quick on the go, then I'll break out the CLX10 inside of my modifier, turn that to my subjects, and then light them and be able to capture the environment. Or if I'm in a situation where there's a lot of movement and I need rapid fire and I don't want my flash to misfire, then I'll use my Stella Pro Reflex S, which it's not quite a flash, but it is a flash. But the main thing is that the Reflex S does not misfire. So you can literally hold down your shutter, let it flash over and over and over again, and each time your subject will always be lit properly. When it comes to modifiers, my go-to is always my mag box. That thing goes with me everywhere. That thing has traveled around the world with me several times over. It's extremely durable, so if I'm out on location and for some reason the wind blows it over or something like that, I don't have to worry about it breaking. It just takes a beating and it just keeps on going. My second choice for modifier is the Westcott Octa M. Now I do like that because it's a lot larger than my Mac box, so I have more coverage on my subjects, especially if I need lighting coverage on a larger number of people. Now in situations where I'm in a pinch, or maybe I'm just being lazy, I have taken my mag sphere and just attached that to the light and use that to be able to put lighting on my subject, and sometimes even putting a grid inside to cut down on the amount of light so it just doesn't spill everywhere. Now, I get asked about my light stand all the time. Generally, in situations like this, if I'm shooting on the go, I'm using a Manfrotto Nano stand to be able to support my light. Most of the time, I do have an assistant with me who can hold the light, but there are other occasions where I don't have someone with me, and it's sturdy enough to be able to handle the weight of the light and the mag box, so it will take on those other modifiers with no problem. Now for the lighting setup, the majority of the time it's just one light. I prefer a moodier look to my images, so that light is always going to come in from one direction or the other. Sometimes I'll do something that's more along the lines of split light, but for the most part you'll always see me going for some sort of Rembrandt style setup. There have been occasions where I have an assistant coming in and holding the light up overhead and I'm shooting the subject flat lit, but that's usually a rare occasion. That might just be a constraint to the environment that I'm shooting in. Maybe I'm on the side of a cliff and getting the light over to the side isn't really something that I can do in that moment. Or maybe it's a situation where the subject has a little bit rougher skin, so lighting them from the side is gonna accentuate the texture in their skin, and that's not something that I wanna do. So if I flat light them, then the light will go in and then fill in any rough patches in the skin. There are occasions where I do use two lights. It might be two lights from the same side because I want a more broad light across my subjects, and then maybe an additional light just focusing on the faces to make their faces pop off a little bit more. Maybe I have the subject standing apart and I need a light to be able to focus on each one of my subjects. Or there have been occasions where I have a light that's my key light on my subjects, and then that secondary light is coming in and adding some sort of rim to make them pop off of the background, or maybe even adding a little bit of color to make them pop off the background as well. In all of those situations, my key light is always feathered across, so I want the light to come and skim across the front of my subjects. One, because I want to be able to control the spill that's on the background if my subject is closer to whatever the environment is that I'm photographing. But two, I'm just not a fan of just taking light and just throwing it everywhere and it not having any rhyme or reason, which to me detracts from the overall photo. Now, every once in a while, I may even feather the light up as well. And that's primarily because I want to control the amount of spill that's coming on to the ground around my subject. Personally, I just don't like that look. I've seen images like that in the past, and that's no knock against anybody else that does it, but I hate to see a darker environment and then this big puddle of light on the floor next to the subject. It just kind of detracts from the overall image to me. So I do my best to control that as much as possible, and then if I need to bring it down in post, then I can also do that as well. Now, when it comes to getting the actual shot, I'm typically exposing for my environment. My goal is to prioritize whatever the highlights are inside of the environment, because those are things that I can't control, or prioritizing any ambient light. So if you're shooting the front of a building and there's windows or lamps on the outside, I want to be able to expose for those so that they show up properly in my final image. Now, if I'm in a situation where I'm using the sun as the key light on my subject, then I'm exposing for the highlights on my subject, not the environment. Now, in the situations where you're exposing for the environment, this is 9 times out of 10 gonna put you in a situation where your subject is underexposed. And this is where your lighting equipment comes in. At that point, once you've gotten your ambient exposure set inside of the camera, now you can use your light, whether it be a flash or a constant light, to be able to light your subject properly so that you have the perfect exposure on your subject and your environment. So when it's time to capture the image, I'm usually taking 2 shots. One is with the light properly exposing my client, and then the next shot is a plate shot where I have my lighting assistant move out of the frame, and I'll take that shot and then blend them together in Photoshop to be able to create the perfect image. This could also be the case if you have somebody that's tossing the veil and you need to Photoshop them out as well. It's much easier to take the photograph and then take a plate shot than to just Photoshop them out altogether. Now in the past, I've had people ask me why I don't just have the light off camera firing into my subject. And that's again because I want to be able to control the light. The further I move that light away from my subject, the more power I need in order to be able to capture my photograph. The more power that I have on the light, the more it's just going to spread throughout the entire scene and contaminate it, which is what I'm trying to avoid. So whereas the Photoshop option might be a little bit more time consuming, I do have the ability to be able to capture a better overall image. So I'd rather do that, even though it's going to take me much more time to complete the final image. So if you take environmental portraits, I'm curious to know what your setup is like. What lenses are you using? And what are your go-to lights and modifiers? Chime in the comments and let me know, and come back and see my next video where I'll be doing a full tutorial of how I shot one of my favorite environmental portraits of the last year.